My husband told his lawyer I owned nothing. He never checked the deed in the cedar box he served me divorce papers on a Tuesday evening. At my own kitchen island, while the dishwasher was running, he set the folder down without looking at me and said, "Everything's already allocated, you just need to sign." He did not sit. He did not explain. He stood on the other side of that pale limestone countertop with the posture of a man who has already moved on to his next item on the agenda, and he waited for me to comply. I picked up the folder. I read to the third page. Under the heading for separate real property, Martin Hadfield, none. Under the heading for separate real property, Lenora Hadfield, none. I set the folder back down on the island. I did not sign. What Martin did not know, what none of them knew, not Martin, not his brother Jeffrey, not a single attorney on their side, was that a cedar box on the mudroom shelf held a recorded deed to a 2.4-acre parcel in Glendale, Arizona, appraised at $4.7 million. His development group had been circling that exact parcel for 3 years. The deed was in my name. It had been in my name since 1993, and I had never once mentioned it. Good day, dear listeners. It's Sienna again, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. And tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. People always say that the quiet ones in a room are the ones with nothing to contribute. I used to find that useful. Not insulting. Useful, there's a particular freedom in being underestimated that most people never discover. Most people spend their whole lives working to be seen. My father was not one of those people. He was a civil engineer who read plat maps the way other men read newspapers, automatically, fluently, finding the meaning in an instant. He believed that the most important information a person could ever possess was the legal description of what they owned. He said, "Always know what your name is on." He said it the way other fathers say, "Look both ways." A law of the physical world, not a suggestion. I was 9 years old the first time he drove me out to a section corner in a field east of Tempe and showed me how to find a survey monument in the desert brush, a small brass disc set in concrete, stamped with numbers and a date. He handed me a plat map, folded to the right section, and told me to find it on the page. I found it. He said, "Good, now you know what this piece of ground is called in the language that counts." I never forgot that morning. I thought about it many times across the following decades, standing in the Hadfield kitchen, holding a coffee pot, listening to men describe parcels of land I could have described more precisely than any of them. I had kept my father's advice, and his deed, in a cedar box for 23 years. What I had never told anyone, not even the person who shared my bed for all of that time, was what the box contained. I was 51 years old the autumn Martin handed me those papers. I had left the Maricopa County Planning Office at 31, when our daughter Cassandra was born and our son Tyler was 2. 20 years away from a job title. What I had not been away from, not for a single week of those 20 years, was the work itself. Do you know the difference between a job and a skill? A job you can lose. A skill you carry with you into every room you ever enter. I attended every zoning board meeting Martin attended. I sat in folding chairs at public hearings across Chandler, Tempe, the Deer Valley Corridor, Peoria, and I read every plat map, every traffic study, every engineering report that crossed our kitchen table, because they crossed that table constantly, and because reading them was as natural to me as reading the weather. Martin and his brother Jeffrey assumed this was recreational at best. Nobody asked whether the interest might be professional. Nobody asked me much of anything, professionally speaking, in 23 years of that house. The McCormick Ranch home had wide tile floors and a kitchen island the color of pale limestone. That island was where the Hadfield family held every informal business meeting I ever witnessed. Martin would stand on one side. Jeffrey would stand on the other, or pace, or lean against the refrigerator with his arms folded and his chin tilted the way he did when he was calculating something. Whoever Jeffrey had brought that week, an engineer, a zoning attorney, a city council contact, would sit on the bar stools. And I was present for most of those conversations. I refilled the coffee. I moved the fruit bowl to make room for rolled site plans. I said nothing of substance. And after the first several years, nobody expected me to. That invisibility had been true for so long that I had stopped registering it as a slight. It was simply the texture of the room. Have you ever stopped hearing a sound because it has been present long enough to become background? That was what being spoken past had become for me. Background. The refrigerator hum of a marriage. The cedar box lived on the second shelf of the mudroom, between a row of rain boots and a basket of junk mail that never got sorted. It was 12 inches by 8, with a brass latch that had tarnished over the years to a warm amber color. When you opened it, it smelled of very old paper and something dry and woody underneath, the cedar doing its work even after 4 decades. I had carried that box from my childhood bedroom to a studio apartment in Tempe, from the studio to the rental house Martin and I shared before we bought in McCormick Ranch, and from there to the mudroom shelf where it had sat, entirely unremarked, for the whole of our marriage. Martin walked past it every time he left through the garage. In 23 years, he had never opened it. He had never asked about it. He had never asked what was in it, what it was for, or whose it was. To him, I think, it registered the way I registered in those kitchen meetings, present, familiar, beneath a direct question. Have you ever been in a room full of people who were making decisions about your life while talking around you? Not to you. Around you. That was the Hadfield Group planning dinner in the autumn of 2019. A dinner at the McCormick Ranch House, 8 people at the dining table, Martin at the head, Jeffrey beside him, and a collection of engineers and investors down the sides. I had made the dinner. I had set the table. I was present throughout. At some point, Jeffrey was explaining the Hadfield Group's acquisition strategy for the following year, and he gestured down the table toward where I was sitting and said, with a warmth that I recognized as performative even then, "Lenora stays at the table, not the board." A laugh moved around the table. Martin smiled into his wineglass. Cassandra, who was 22 and had driven up from Tucson for the weekend, went very still in her chair across from me. I did not react. I had been practicing not reacting to Jeffrey for 17 years by that point, and I was very good at it. I picked up my fork. I refilled the man beside me with more water. I stayed at the table as instructed. What I did not do was forget it. The first warning sign that Martin was preparing to move arrived in the form of a language change. For years, he had referred to development projects by their locations: the Peoria build, the Chandler assemblage, the Scottsdale deal. He spoke about a site in Glendale, the same neutral geographic way, the Glendale parcel. Then, at some point in the spring of the year before he filed, the phrasing shifted. It became my Glendale deal. One possessive word. The change was small enough that you would only catch it if you were paying close attention, and I had always been paying close attention. I simply did not advertise the fact. He also began taking those Glendale calls in the driveway rather than the kitchen. Stepping outside even in January when the desert cold settled in hard by 5 in the afternoon. He tucked his phone into his jacket pocket when he came back in, rather than setting it on the island the way he usually did. I noticed. I filed it in the same part of my mind where I stored survey descriptions, organized, labeled, untouched, ready. The second warning came in the form of paper, which is always the most reliable kind of evidence. Are you the kind of person who notices what other people leave behind? I am. Jeffrey had been at the house for a meeting in October, a longer one than usual, with a man I had not seen before, an engineer type who had spread a site plan across the island and anchored its corners with a coffee mug and Martin stapler. I had come through to refill my own coffee, and Jeffrey had said, with the particular warmth of a man in a good mood about money, "Stay at the table, Lenora." Not the board, a line he had been using long enough that it had become a kind of joke between the men, a reference to the 2019 dinner that was supposed to read as affectionate and landed, every time, as the thing it actually was. I smiled and took my coffee to the other room. When the men left, Jeffrey forgot a document on the island. A development prospectus, bound 30-something pages, Hadfield Group logo on the cover. I picked it up to put it in the recycling. Before I did, I read the site description on page 4. Section and quarter section call, acreage to the 100th, 2.4 acres, Glendale at the freeway interchange. I recognized the legal description the way you recognize your own face in a photograph. I put the prospectus in the recycling. I went to the mudroom. I looked at the cedar box on the shelf. I did not open it that evening. I did not need to. I already knew everything that was inside. Martin served the divorce papers on a Tuesday, timed, as I came to understand later, to give his attorneys the rest of the business week to file. He set the folder on the island at 6:15 in the evening. He was wearing a charcoal blazer and still had his watch on, which meant he had come directly from the office. He said, "Everything's already allocated, you just need to sign." He had a very specific tone he used when he believed a matter was already decided. Not unkind, not hostile, simply closed. Final. The tone of a zoning board vote when the outcome was never in question. I asked him what allocated meant in that context. He said, "You'll get the house and a fair maintenance figure. The rest is business assets." I picked up the folder. The asset disclosure was on the 3rd page. I read it carefully, top to bottom, the way my father taught me to read a legal description. Every word carrying a specific meaning, every omission a specific choice. Under separate real property, Martin Hadfield, none. Under separate real property, Lenora Hadfield, none. I read that line twice. I set the folder on the island. I told Martin I would need to review the documents with my attorney. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has encountered a minor scheduling delay. Not alarmed, simply inconvenienced, and then he picked up his keys from the hook by the garage door and left. I heard his car start. I heard the garage door roll up and then back down. I stood at the island for 2 minutes after the sound faded. I was not shaking. I was something closer to the opposite of shaking, a stillness with a temperature to it, like a room that has just been vacated after a long silence. The dishwasher moved through its cycle. The house was quiet. I left the folder where it was and went to bed. The following morning, I made coffee. I stood at the island and read the asset disclosure a second time. Slowly, the way you read something when you want to be certain you have understood its full meaning and not just its apparent one. Then I went to the mudroom. The cedar box was on the second shelf, where it had always been. The brass latch was cold under my fingers. The smell rose immediately when I lifted the lid. Old paper, cedar. The specific dry smell of documents that have been carefully kept. Behind the insurance certificates, behind Tyler and Cassandra's old passports, behind the folder of household warranties for appliances we had replaced years ago, was a clear plastic sleeve. Inside it were 3 documents that had been waiting, patiently, for 23 years. The first was the original 1993 recorded warranty deed, Harold Pruitt, civil engineer, as grantor, Lenora Ann Pruitt, his daughter, as sole grantee. The parcel described by its full legal description, section and quarter section and chain of title, with the Maricopa County Recorder's stamp in the upper right corner, dated the summer before my wedding. The second was my father's transfer letter, a single handwritten page, signed and notarized, explaining his intention in language that was precise and gentle and entirely him. "Keep it," he had written. "Do not mix it with anything joint. One day this will be worth the waiting." The third was the appraisal I had ordered 18 months earlier, when I read in the Glendale Planning Commission minutes that the commercial rezoning at the interchange had been approved. 47 pages. Cover figure, $4,700,000. Commercial mixed use, highest and best use analysis, comparable sales going back 5 years. I had read every page of it when it arrived. I set all 3 documents on the island side by side, in the exact place where Martin had put the divorce folder the night before. I stood back and looked at them. I was not angry. I was not vindicated, exactly. What I was, if I am honest with you, was curious. The specific curiosity of someone who has already worked out the answer to a problem and wants to see whether the answer behaves in practice exactly the way it behaved in her head. I sat at the island for a long time with those 3 documents in front of me. At some point, my coffee went cold, and I didn't refresh it. I was thinking about a specific morning, a summer morning in 1993, 2 months after my father had recorded the deed. He had driven me out to the Glendale interchange to look at the land in person for the first time since he had bought it. It was undeveloped scrub, pale and flat, with the freeway overpass visible to the north and the smell of diesel and dry grass in the air. Not beautiful, not obviously valuable, just land. We walked the perimeter, which took about 12 minutes at a moderate pace. My father had the plat in one hand and was reading the section lines against the landscape, pointing out where the survey monuments should be. He found one, a piece of rebar capped with a survey disc, half buried at the corner of the property. He crouched down and pressed his palm flat against it and looked up at me and said, "This is yours. Not this land. This is yours. All of it." I remember thinking, at 20 years old, that the land looked like not very much. He must have seen that thought on my face, because he said, "It never looks like anything until it does." Then he stood up and dusted his hands on his trousers, and we drove to a diner on Camelback, and he bought me lunch and explained, in precise detail, exactly how to read an appraisal report. I had kept every word of that explanation. I had read 9 appraisal reports in the years since, including this one, the one sitting on the island in front of me now, with its cover figure of $4,700,000, and I had found his explanation accurate every time. My father had purchased the Glendale parcel in 1992 as a long investment, a piece of undeveloped land at a freeway interchange outside the city that he believed would eventually become valuable as the metro expanded. He transferred it to me by recorded warranty deed the summer of 1993, the year before I met Martin, 2 years before my wedding. He sat me down at the kitchen table in his house in Mesa, and he explained what he was doing in the same careful way he explained everything that mattered. "The parcel is yours," he said. "It is in your name alone. Do not put anyone else's name on it. Do not borrow against it. Do not use household money to maintain it. There is nothing to maintain. Let it sit. When the time comes, you will know what it is worth, because you will have learned how to read the map by then." He handed me the deed in a clear sleeve and a folded plat map, the 1992 survey plat, with section lines marked in blue ink, the interchange drawn in pencil in the margin. He had written my name at the top of the plat in his careful engineer's hand. I put both documents in the Cedar box that evening. I had never taken them out again until this morning. Under Arizona law, property held in sole name prior to marriage and never commingled into marital assets remains separate property regardless of how long the marriage lasts. Commingling means using marital funds to improve or maintain the asset, placing it in a joint account, refinancing it jointly, or taking out a home equity line against it. I had done none of those things. The land had sat in my name, fallow, for 31 years. Martin had spent money on other people's land for 23 of those years. None of his money, none of our household income, had ever touched the Glendale parcel. The deed was clean, the recorder's stamp was dated, the appraisal was current, and Martin had just sworn, under penalty of perjury, in a document filed with the court, that I held no separate real property. I closed the Cedar box. I went back to the island. I picked up my phone and called Roxanne Eberly. Roxanne was the attorney a college friend had recommended 3 weeks before Martin filed, a former Maricopa County Assessor's Counsel with 20 years of real property dispute experience, a woman who approached each case. Her assistant told me when I scheduled, like a puzzle she was fairly confident she had already solved. I had met her once before, in late October, when Martin's driveway phone calls had graduated from a pattern I was monitoring to a pattern I had decided to take seriously. That consultation had lasted an hour and 40 minutes. I had described the Cedar box and what it contained without bringing it with me, and she had listened the way good attorneys listen, without interrupting, without performing reaction, writing steadily on a yellow legal pad. At the end, she had said, "If he files with a disclosure that omits that asset, call me the same day." I was calling her the same day. She picked up on the second ring. I told her the papers had been served. She said, "Bring the box." I drove to her office the following morning. The glass and limestone building in downtown Phoenix stood at the edge of the financial district, the lobby smelling of recycled air and something faintly metallic, the specific neutrality of spaces built for transactions. Roxanne's conference room was on the 7th floor, east-facing windows, a long table, a whiteboard at the far end with a case number already written at the top in black marker. She was already seated when I arrived, legal pad squared in front of her, 2 pens parallel beside it. I set the Cedar box on the table and opened the latch. The smell of old paper rose between us. She removed the clear sleeve with the deed inside, held it toward the window light, and read it fully without speaking. She was very still while she read. When she finished, she set the document on the table. She picked up one of her pens. She looked at me across the box and said, "Oh, this is good." 2 words. Then she began writing. I sat down across from her, and I waited, watching the thin December light moving across the buildings outside the east windows, and I did not feel the need to fill the silence. She explained the law with the efficiency of someone who has explained it many times and has no patience for approximation. Premarital separate property, sole name. Never commingled, it stays separate regardless of marriage length. There was no ambiguity in this parcel's history. No marital funds had touched it. No joint instrument had ever been recorded against it. It had simply sat in Lenora Ann Pruitt's name, which was now legally Lenora Ann Hadfield, née Pruitt, waiting in a county recorder's database for someone to look it up. Roxanne said Martin's disclosure had created a specific kind of problem for him. Filing a false sworn statement in a divorce proceeding is not a procedural error. It is perjury. The false statement did not make the parcel marital property. It made Martin's entire position in the proceeding vulnerable to a correction that would require a full recalculation of the asset picture. And that recalculation would not favor him. She tapped her pen against the legal pad 3 times. which I came to understand was what she did when a fact pattern had arranged itself into something she found particularly satisfying. She said, "He handed us the leverage. We didn't have to manufacture anything." I told her that Martin had always been better at acquiring other people's assets than at asking the people around him what they owned. She wrote that down. We met a second time 4 days later, and Roxanne used that session to prepare me for the procedural steps ahead. Not a deposition, there was no deposition, but what she called a landscape review, which meant she asked me questions about the parcel's history and I answered them, and she noted which answers were strong and which required documentation to support. How had the land been maintained? It had not required maintenance. It was bare ground, agricultural zoned. Had I ever authorized anyone else to act on the parcel's behalf? No. Had any Hadfield entity ever been named in any document related to the parcel as a lessee, an optionee, a prospective buyer? Not to my knowledge, and I would have noticed, because my name was the controlling name on the title record. And any encumbrance or option would have appeared in a title search. Roxanne said, "Good." Then she asked me whether I had ever discussed the parcel with Martin in any form, a casual mention, a reference to the family land, anything that might be characterized as notice. I told her that I had not. I told her that in 23 years of sitting at the edge of his planning conversations, I had listened to him describe a great many parcels, and he had never once asked me what parcels I was familiar with personally. She said, "That is exactly as useful as the deed itself." She wrote 4 lines on the legal pad and underlined the last one. I did not ask her what the last line said. I went to the Maricopa County Recorder's office one morning the week after our second meeting. Not because the recorded deed required my physical presence to be valid, but because I wanted to hold the instrument in my hands one more time before it entered the procedural record. The Recorder's office is a functional, fluorescent-lit government space in the county administrative campus in downtown Phoenix, the kind of space that has the same quality as all official spaces. Designed for transaction, indifferent to the nature of the transaction being conducted. I gave my name. I gave the parcel's app, assessor's parcel number, which I had known from memory since the day my father first wrote it in the margin of the plat. The clerk pulled the record on her screen and confirmed it. Warranty deed, recorded 1993, grantee Lenora Ann Pruitt. No liens, no encumbrances. No recorded instruments against the parcel at all in 31 years. A clean title. She printed the record summary and handed it across the counter. I thanked her. I walked back to my car. I sat for a moment before I started the engine. 31 years of a piece of land sitting quietly in a county database, in my name, in my father's handwriting on a transfer letter in a cedar box on a mudroom shelf. Do you know what it feels like to have a long patience confirmed? It is not excitement, exactly. It is something quieter and more settled than that. I started the car and drove home. Have you ever watched someone absorb news that unravels a plan they were very confident in? That is what happened when Roxanne filed the corrective response to Martin's asset disclosure, 10 days after our meeting in the 7th floor conference room. The filing attached the recorded deed in full, the transfer letter, and the 2024 appraisal at $4. $7 million, along with a cover brief explaining the separate property classification under Arizona statute. It was 12 pages, clean, economical, every citation precise. The day after it was filed, Roxanne's phone rang. It was Martin's lead attorney requesting an urgent conference call. Urgent. That particular word choice told its own story. The call was set for that same afternoon. I was not on it. Roxanne handled it alone, which was the correct decision. She called me afterward and read me her notes in the level, neutral voice she used for things she found significant. Martin's attorney had argued that the parcel's appreciation during the marriage created an equitable interest for the marital estate. It is not an unreasonable argument in the abstract. There are fact patterns where it has prevailed in Arizona. This was not one of those fact patterns, because Lenora Pruitt had owned that land outright before she was Lenora Hadfield, had contributed nothing marital to it, had taken nothing marital from it, and had allowed it to sit undisturbed through 23 years of a marriage in which her husband had made a very comfortable living developing other people's land. Roxanne said the call lasted 4 minutes total. She said Martin's attorney went quiet near the end in a specific way, not the quiet of reflection, but the quiet of someone who has run out of road and has stopped driving. Martin's legal team filed a formal motion 3 weeks after the corrective filing. The motion argued that Lenora's enjoyment of the marital lifestyle during the period of the parcel's appreciation constituted an equitable basis for recharacterization of the asset. It was 3 times longer than Roxanne's corrective brief. It cited a single Arizona Court of Appeals case from 2007 that, on careful reading, did not say what the motion claimed it said. Roxanne's response was 12 pages and cited 6 cases. She read me the conclusion paragraph over the phone the evening before she filed it. Her language was measured and, in a purely legal sense, devastating. The motion was denied within 3 weeks. Court rulings are dry documents, but this one had a phrase in its operative paragraph I found worth remembering. The parcel presents the straightforward case of premarital separate property, clearly recorded, never commingled. Straightforward, I thought about the 23 years of planning meetings I had attended in silence, the plat maps I had read without being asked, Jeffrey's stay at the table line, Martin's driveway phone calls in the January cold, and I found the word oddly satisfying. What did the denial mean in practical terms? It meant Martin's initial settlement proposal, the house at $1.1 million appraised value, plus $3,200 per month in maintenance for 7 years, a total of roughly $1. $37 million was now calculated against a reality in which I held $4.7 million in confirmed separate property. That property was off the table entirely. It would not enter the marital estate. It would not be divided. It would not be offset. It was mine, and it had always been mine, and the disclosure claiming otherwise was a court record with Martin's signature on it. The equitable distribution of actual marital assets, recalculated correctly, plus a spousal support figure accounting for 23 years out of the workforce, those numbers were now considerably different from what Martin's team had proposed. The gap between his original offer and the corrected figure was $1.9 million in additional transfers. His attorneys knew this arithmetic as well as Roxanne did. Everyone in this proceeding now knew exactly what the situation was. Jeffrey reached out to me directly 12 days after the motion was denied. A text message, politely worded, more politely than he had spoken to me in the flesh in the entire 17 years I had known him. He asked whether we could speak informally, without attorneys present, to see whether there was a resolution that could work for everyone. I read the message once. I forwarded it to Roxanne without adding a word. Her reply came within the hour, "Do not respond. I'll handle any contact from his side." 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at Roxanne's office from Jeffrey's personal attorney, a firm separate from Martin's legal team, which was itself a detail Roxanne noted with interest. The letter proposed to purchase the Glendale parcel at $890,000, which was its pre-rezoning appraised value as of 2019, 5 years earlier. The logic, such as it was, held that the rezoning had generated the increase in value, and that the increase therefore belonged to the market rather than to me. What the logic did not address was that my name had been on the deed for 31 years. Through every phase of the land's history, agricultural zoning, holding period, rezoning, and reappraisal, and that markets do not determine whose name is on a recorded warranty deed. Roxanne drafted the response herself and read it to me before she sent it. Her client declines. 4 words. Sent the same afternoon. Tyler called from Seattle the week after the corrective filing entered the public record. He was 28, working in software, and he processed information the way software engineers tend to, methodically, one layer at a time, without displaying the emotion until he had finished processing it. He asked whether I was all right. I said yes. He asked whether I had known about the Glendale parcel the entire marriage. I said yes. There was a pause on the line, not an uncomfortable one, more the pause of someone rearranging a picture they thought they had already understood. Then he said, quietly, "So you just held it." I told him that holding something and hiding something are different activities. He said he supposed they were. He asked me if I needed anything from Seattle. I told him that I appreciated the call and that he should have Roxanne's number in case anyone from Martin's side contacted him. He said he would. Before he hung up, he said, "Grandpa would have thought this was exactly right." I told him I thought so too. I did not say it to be sentimental. I said it because I believed it. Cassandra called twice during those weeks, once from her apartment in New York, the second time from the lobby of her office building during a lunch break, because she had read something in an email I had forwarded and wanted to talk through it. She was 26 and working in urban planning, a career she had chosen, she told me once. Partly because of all the zoning board meetings she had attended as a teenager. She had been at the planning dinner in 2019 when Jaffrey said the stay at the table line. She had been 22, recently graduated, visiting from Tucson where she was finishing her degree. When Jaffrey said it, she had gone still in her chair across from me. She had not said anything, because there is no good way to respond to a comment like that in a room full of men who are laughing at it, especially when you are 22 and the man speaking is your father's brother. But she had not forgotten it. She told me, on the second call, "I have been waiting for 4 years to see what you were going to do about that." I told her that I had been waiting 31 years to do what I had just done, and that some things deserve a long runway. She laughed at that, genuinely, the way she laughed when something struck her as both funny and exactly true. What was the state of the house during those weeks? Martin had moved to a hotel in Old Town Scottsdale the week after he served me the papers, which I thought was a reasonable decision. The McCormick Ranch house was quiet in a way it had not been for years, possibly for the whole of our marriage. I went to yoga on Tuesday mornings. I went to the farmer's market on Saturdays and bought the kind of produce I had always wanted to buy, but hadn't, because Martin did not eat certain things, and I had stopped selecting for my own preferences long before I noticed I had done it. In the evenings, I sat at the island and read whatever Roxanne had sent me that day. Briefs, filings, case summaries, or I read nothing at all, which was also a new kind of permission. The desert evenings in November have a particular quality I had somehow never fully absorbed in 23 years of living there. The temperature drops fast once the sun sets. The light goes from copper to gray in less than 20 minutes, and in the silence after the drop, when the pool pump cuts out and the traffic on the main road thins, you can hear the absolute desert quiet, the specific quiet of a place where heat has been the constant and its departure feels like a held breath released. I pulled the plat map out of the Cedar box one evening in late November, the folded 1992 survey plat my father had tucked behind the deed when he gave it to me, the one with the section lines in blue ink and the interchange penciled in the margin in his hand. I spread it on the island. Martin had an almost identical survey plat hanging in a frame in his study, one of the decorative items he had collected over the years to signal seriousness about land. I had never told him the framed plat in his study covered the same survey area as the one in my Cedar box. I had simply noticed it the first time I saw it hanging there, perhaps 12 years into the marriage, and filed the fact away without comment. I looked at my father's plat on the island that November evening, at his penciled notation in the margin, at my name written in his careful hand at the top. Then I folded it back along its original creases and returned it to the cedar box behind the deed. The plat had been read. Its message had been received. It had done everything it was meant to do. Roxanne walked me through the financial exposure calculation in our fourth meeting, 10 days before the settlement conference. She laid the corrected asset summary on the table and explained Martin's original proposal against the revised picture. He had proposed $1.1 million in house equity plus $3,200 monthly for 7 years, a total, if you carried it to present value, of roughly $1.37 million. What he had not accounted for, because he had not known to account for it, was the full weight of 23 years of spousal support offset against $4.7 million in separate property that he could no longer use as a negotiating chip. The recalculated equitable distribution of marital assets, the actual marital assets, the ones that had always been joint, plus the corrected spousal support figure, came to $1.9 million in additional transfers beyond his original proposal. His attorneys had confirmed this arithmetic in the filing record. There was nothing to dispute about the number. The question was not whether the number was accurate. The question was how many additional procedural steps Martin's team wanted to take before arriving at the obvious destination. Roxanne said she expected them to settle at the conference. She said she had seen this pattern many times. Men who build elaborate strategies on the assumption that the person across the table holds fewer cards than she does, and who eventually become very efficient signers once the cards have been counted in public. She recommended I bring the cedar box to the settlement conference. I asked whether that was strictly necessary, whether the documents alone, in their clear sleeves, would be sufficient. She said it was not strictly necessary. She said it was useful. There is a difference, she told me, between presenting a document and presenting the container it has lived in for 31 years. The container tells its own story. The container is an argument. I told her I trusted her judgment on questions of presentation. She had been doing this for 20 years, and I had been watching people present arguments at planning tables for just as long, and we both knew that sometimes the object says the thing that the language cannot. The settlement conference was held on a Wednesday morning in the third week of December. I carried the cedar box from the parking garage into the lobby and up to the 7th floor without ceremony, by its side handle, the way I had always carried it. The conference room had the same east-facing windows, but the December morning light was flat and silver gray rather than the warm amber I remembered from October. The kind of light that makes a room feel very clear and very final. Martin was already seated at the near end of the table when I arrived, with his lead attorney beside him. Jeffrey was at the far end, there as a Hadfield Group observer, a role his attorney had argued for and been granted, which Roxanne had noted with quiet satisfaction, because it meant Jeffrey would be in the room for every moment of what was about to happen. I sat across from Martin. Roxanne sat beside me. She placed the cedar box on the table, opened the latch, removed the deed from its clear sleeve, and set it face up in the exact center of the table, between the two sides, under the window light. Jeffrey reached across the table and picked up the appraisal report from Roxanne's exhibit stack. He turned to the cover page. He read the figure. He set the report back down. He did not speak for the rest of the meeting. That was the last time Jeffrey Hadfield communicated anything to me, in any form, directly or otherwise. Martin looked at the deed. He looked at it for a long time, longer than it takes to read a single page, which told me he was not reading it anymore, but rather experiencing something about it that required additional time to fully absorb. I watched his face the way I had watched him read engineering reports and site plans across 23 years of that kitchen island. The slight tightening around the eyes was there, the jaw gone still. And then, after a long moment, something different. A loosening, a loss of angle, the look of a calculation that has stopped calculating. He looked at the deed. Then, he looked away. He looked at the table surface in front of him, which is the direction a person looks when they are deciding not to look at the thing they have just seen. Roxanne presented the settlement terms in the clear, methodical language she used for everything. The $4.7 million Glendale parcel, off the table, separate property, confirmed, final, equitable distribution of marital assets, the revised figure, spousal support, revised term, revised monthly amount. The McCormick Ranch house, to Martin, as his original proposal had specified, since he had wanted it and I did not. The total additional transfer to Lenora Hadfield beyond Martin's original filing, $1.9 million. Martin's attorney asked for a recess. 14 minutes. They came back in 14 minutes, and the attorney placed a pen on the table. Martin picked it up. He signed the settlement agreement without making eye contact with anyone across from him. Not with me, not with Roxanne. The way a person signs something when they understand that the argument is already over and they are performing the administrative act that confirms it. Roxanne collected the signed document. She put the deed back in its clear sleeve, put the sleeve back in the cedar box, and closed the latch. She made one note on her legal pad. I picked up my coat. We took the elevator down to the parking garage without speaking, because there was nothing that needed to be said that had not already been said by the documents on the table. I called Cassandra from the parking garage. The line rang twice. I told her it was done, and that the terms were what we had expected. There was a pause on the line. Then she laughed. A full, unhesitating, genuine laugh. The kind that goes a few seconds past where you expect it to stop because something has struck the person as completely, precisely true. When she finished, she said, "He never asked you a single thing about what you owned. It was not a question." She had been arriving at that conclusion for some time and was simply stating it aloud. I told her that he had not. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she wanted to come home for Christmas, not to McCormick Ranch, which she already knew was going, but wherever I landed. I told her I thought I knew where I was going to land, and that she would like it. I kept the parcel. Within 2 months of the settlement conference, I had a new revocable trust drafted, with Cassandra named as successor beneficiary and the Glendale parcel transferred into it. The trust document was 31 pages. I read every one of them. Roxanne confirmed the transfer documentation was clean. I retired the cedar box into Cassandra's keeping, the original deed inside, the plat map behind it, my father's transfer letter in its original envelope. She called me from her apartment in New York when the box arrived by courier and sat on her kitchen table, and she said she understood now what her grandfather had meant when he said, "Always know what your name is on." I told her I was glad it had made the trip. The McCormick Ranch house sold in the spring. Martin had it in the settlement. He was welcome to the kitchen island and the wide tile floors and the smell of pool chlorine and every informal planning meeting those walls had hosted. I did not go back for anything I cared about keeping. I had taken what I needed before the conference. In April, I found a house in Tempe, 2 blocks from the university, in a neighborhood of old block construction and overgrown bougainvillea, and a breakfast place on the corner that opened at 6:30. The house was 1,400 square feet. It had a mudroom with exactly 1 shelf. It did not have anything on that shelf yet. That first morning in the new house, I stood in the mudroom doorway and looked at the empty shelf and thought about the second shelf in the McCormick Ranch mudroom, and about the brass latch and the old paper smell and the 31 years of waiting that the cedar box had stood patiently for. Then I went to make coffee. The absence of the box on that particular shelf felt, if anything, correct, the right object in the right place, which was now in Cassandra's hands, which is where things of value should eventually go. The appraisal report, the 47-page bound document, was on my kitchen table most evenings in those first weeks in Tempe, open to the comparable sales section with a mug of tea beside it. I read the comparable sales section 3 times in full, not for any procedural purpose, the matter was settled, but because comparable sales analysis is simply interesting to me, and has been since the first time my father explained how an appraiser determines value by reference to what similar properties have sold for in similar conditions. I found the analysis sound. The $4.7 million figure was well supported. I had thought it was well supported when I first read the report 18 months earlier. Nothing that happened in the settlement conference had changed my view of the appraiser's methodology. I closed the report on the third evening and put it on the bookshelf in the study, which was a small room with a window that faced a bougainvillea-covered block wall, and which was becoming, slowly and without urgency, a room that felt like mine. What is the honest cost of a thing like this? I do not want to suggest to you that it is nothing, or that justice arrives in a conference room and rearranges everything cleanly. It does not. 23 years of being spoken past does not resolve the moment a pen is set on a table. There are habits of invisibility that take longer to unlearn than a settlement takes to finalize. There are things I had organized my life around, assumptions that had stood long enough to feel like facts, and those things do not simply lift because the legal record has been corrected. I had Cassandra's visits and Tyler's calls, and the breakfast place on the corner where the woman who worked the morning shift remembered, after 3 weeks, that I wanted my coffee without sugar. Small things, accurate things, the kind of things that constitute a life when you have stopped organizing your life around someone else's assumptions about what you contain. Jeffrey never contacted me again, not by message, not by attorney, not through mutual acquaintance. That particular silence, the absence of a voice that had spent 17 years explaining what I could and could not be present for, was, as I said to Cassandra on one of her visits, not a loss I found difficult to sustain. Always know what your name is on. My father said this to me when I was 9 years old, standing in a desert field, finding a brass survey disc in the dry brush with my hands. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, simply, without drama, expecting me to remember. I did remember. I kept the deed in the cedar box. I kept the cedar box on the shelf. I attended every planning meeting and read every plat map and said almost nothing for 23 years. And what I held was more than patience. It was the knowledge that patience and invisibility are not the same thing, and that being overlooked is a condition, not a verdict. Martin allocated everything in that folder he set on the island. He allocated the house and the maintenance figure and 23 years of a marriage. He allocated everything except the one parcel his development group had been trying to acquire for 3 years, the parcel he had never thought to ask me about, because it had never occurred to him to ask what I owned. That is the cost of never posing the direct question to the person sitting at your own table. If someone in your life has told you that you bring nothing to the board, dear listeners, I would ask you to check every shelf before you agree. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done with that deed? Would you have mentioned it years earlier? Would you have waited, exactly as I did, saying nothing, holding everything, until the moment it mattered? Share this story with someone who keeps their paperwork in order. And thank you, as always, for listening.